Now, the very young and the impressionable should definitely not be watching this program tonight. This is not a Halloween fable. This is a real-life horror story, and it will give small children bad dreams.
Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizzeri, and I do the research and share a story of a video game-related controversy to my friends.
I'm Kate, and I've been writing software for over 10 years, but not the fun kind.
And I am Matt. I am author of the book Gathering of Gamers.
Welcome back for the thrilling conclusion of our look at Patricia Pulling and her group Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons. Last time we learned how Pulling, in response to the sudden tragic death of her son Bink in 1982, set her sights on tabletop role-playing games, particularly Dungeons & Dragons, arguing that they led to violence, to suicide, and were a gateway drug into the occult. And we began looking to the way that she waged her crusade, setting herself up as what she would call an expert in both the occult and role-playing games, and we addressed some of the audiences with which she gained attention. So today we're going to keep doing that. We're going to look at some of the other, at least one more audience that she gained attention with, and start wrapping up our story. And so one other audience that Pulling's warnings were receptive to was the news media, who jumped on the opportunity to put out salacious tales of alleged TTRPG-induced murders and suicides with little in the way of meaningful pushback because, we're competing with home video and Nintendo for viewers' attentions over here, and we need a story that's going to sell. As the old news saying goes, if it bleeds for Satan, it leads on ABC's World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. So this is another important component in this and why Pulling's message got broadcast so much is that news media, local and national, and in some cases international, would pick up her message and broadcast it. They would interview Pat, they would interview Tom Radecki, or they would talk about this idea of alleged D&D induced murders and suicides.
So was she basically like a regular spokesperson?
Oh yeah, they had her on a lot of these. I could pull from a lot of different examples of pull quotes. A couple notable interviews. She had an interview in 1985 on 60 Minutes with Ed Bradley, where she basically said this whole thing about her kid dying, and is basically 60 Minutes is on her side and does not really critically examine that, and has TSR representatives who basically says, how do you answer to your alleged crimes, basically?
You know, what really intrigues me, intellectually speaking, and maybe there's an academic paper here somewhere, is looking into seeing if there's some way through like media analysis to see if all of the times Pulling was on the news, brought as a speaker, railing against Dungeons and Dragons, did it do more harm or did it promote Dungeons and Dragons more? Because as we talked about in a previous episode, one of the reasons D&D launched to fame was because of the whole James Dallas Egbert III incident and everything that surrounded that, and kind of bore into Pat Pulling. Like, if Pat Pulling didn't exist, if James Dallas Egbert didn't do what he did, would D&D be what it is today? And is there some way we can trace that through like some sort of media analysis? I don't know. I just find that a fascinating question as we talk about all of this. I mean, like, everything we talk about, it sounds ridiculous to us, but like, when you think about it from like a marketing perspective, like all of this promo that they're doing, like, it's the old adage, any news is good news, right? Like, is this ultimately beneficial to games like Dungeons and Dragons, or does it really hurt them? And I'd be curious to see if it's different for video games when that transitions in the 90s and the 2000s as well.
Right, like how notorious at this point would, say, Doom be without the reception when it came out? And then Doom in particular being, I think we're jumping ahead a little bit, I guess, with like Doom being the thing that we hold up as like the violent video game that promotes people to shoot people, right? And so then that becomes the thing that everybody holds up when something bad happens and people play video games. Did they play Doom, right? If a person does something bad and did they play games, tabletop games, did they play Dungeons and Dragons?
Yeah, because to your point, Kate, like I don't know the history as well when it comes to like Doom. Like I understand the backgrounds of it, but like I do know with Dungeons and Dragons is when this happened to Dungeons and Dragons in the very late 70s, early 80s, like it got people to play the game. It got people to buy the game. It turned into a nationwide sensation. Did that happen to Doom too? I don't know, Kevin, do you know? I mean, I don't know about that myself.
Yeah, I'll address that in a second. But yeah, I think you made a really good point, man. It's like, you can't buy advertising like this.
Yeah. I mean, I recollect I was a kid, too young to play Doom at the time, but I remember like that was the word on the playground. I was still in Catholic school, and they were like we're talking about Doom. Like my dad has a copy of Doom, and oh, I saw him playing Doom. It's like the thing they don't want you to play, the thing they don't want you to see, right? And to our point in many episodes, we were talking about. God, Kevin, you'll have to help me. When did we talk about that Disney movie, Escape from Tomorrow, where the whole point was they were hoping that it was going to be the movie Disney doesn't want you to see. Disney ignored it, and therefore it died on the vine. This became Doom, the video game, the church doesn't want you to play. D&D, the game that the church, or I don't know, greater society, it sounds like, doesn't want you to play. And therefore, well, now I got to learn a little more about it. What is this thing that you're trying to keep from me, right?
Yeah, there's a level of like, parents are getting concerned about this, but I can see a lot of teenagers and a lot of kids saying, wow, this sounds pretty cool. I'm going to try this out.
And or if you just like see a book on the shelf somewhere, you're like, I'm gonna take that. My parents don't know about it. I'm at the library, I'm checking this out. I don't know.
I know speaking anecdotally, going back to Doom, like the first time I ever heard about Doom was when I saw it on the news. And I thought this looks really cool. And fortunately, I went to a friend's house and his dad made me a copy of the discs for Doom 2. And I've been a fan ever since of that game. Doom is an interesting case because Doom was even beyond moral anxiety over, it ended up being a very big game, very popular game. And the moral panic that people think about with it actually fascinatingly, and we are going to do an episode on this, the moral panic that people think of when they think of Doom did not happen until about 6 years after the game came out. But there were, of course, plenty of news coverage. It's like, this is this shocking new violent game that's taking the world by storm. And on the one hand, you see people wringing their hands about it, but at the same point, it's also spreading the word about that in a way that is beyond the dreams of any advertiser. I know that the same thing happened with Night Trap, for example. Night Trap in 1992 was very obscure, well, relatively obscure. It was one of the games on an add-on for the Sega Genesis, the Sega CD. It was kind of a game that nobody cared about. Well, it kind of came and went, and then all of a sudden got thrown into the moral panic over video games in 1993. And then everyone was hearing about it because every news story was talking about it. And there's Digital Pictures who made this, put out a documentary about a couple of years after the moral panics over Night Trap. And their head, Tom Zito, said to Howard Lincoln was the VP of Nintendo of America at the time, who was one of the people jumping on the dog pile over Night Trap. And he says to the cameras, to Howard, I owe all of my sales of Night Trap to you. And you see a lot of these ideas about like the Streisand effect of these games. And I'm sure that happened with Pat Pulling in D&D too.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that with Night Trap. I was in middle school when that game came out. I don't think I even heard about it until I saw it. I don't know where I saw it. If I read an article, probably not. I was in middle school. What am I doing reading newspapers? But, I saw something on TV about it, or it leaked through, some sort of gamer magazine that I was reading at the time about how, Night Trap is so scandalous. It was rated whatever the equivalent of NC-17 is for video games. It's been so long since I've looked at this, I don't know what that is. But I was like, I gotta play this. I didn't play it mostly because, I was 12, 13 at the time, and there was no way I get my hands on it. But I remember that like really piqued my interest in the game. I'm like, I gotta check this out. This sounds amazing. Why are everyone so bothered about Night Trap? This looks great.
It's like this is the game that they don't want you to play. It's like, Kevin, I've mentioned to you, I have a pretty firm memory as a kid of my dad purchasing Doom and even playing it maybe for the PC. And I also have a pretty solid memory of him like intentionally getting rid of it after some sort of blowback. It honestly may have been in the wake of Columbine. I'm not sure. But like, I just remember Doom being this game that was like radioactive. It's like, have you seen Doom? Like again, if you've never played video games, have you seen like the person in your life who plays video games or computer games? Have you seen them playing Doom? Did you play Doom? He's like, and like if there's the kid who's like allegedly played Doom, like that was a big thing. Like Doom was just like this big thing. And I even remember like the N64, the blood red cartridge, like that was part of the marketing around like the fact that they understood that people thought that this was kind of taboo.
Yeah, and going back to your point, Matt, is like, how much of the exposure is too. I mean, the counterpoint that TSR would make was basically, 4 million people are playing this game right now in the mid 1980s. And the same thing with Doom. By about the mid-1990s, the shareware version had been installed on about 15 million machines. So like it's not adversely affecting their sales, I think, in either regard, D&D or a violent video game like Doom. And in the case of a game like Night Trap, like no one would have cared about Night Trap had it not been for the moral panic. I wrote about this in my dissertation. It's like, I'm gonna be honest, Night Trap's a shitty game. It's not a very good game. Quality-wise, it's a very poor game. There's not a lot to keep you playing it. But the reason why it got thrown into its infamy is because people started freaking out about this game. But yeah, because also going ahead, other video games realized that you could gain a lot of attention if you riled up the news, if you riled up the Moral Crusader crowd. You see games like Postal from 1997 is a good example of that. Their makers running with scissors were very much about any time their game was in the press, they would put out a press release bragging about how everybody thinks this is the most edgy game out there. Like this is a tactic that is employed time and time again. And of course, there were also these anxieties about Satanism that were being broadcast like this too. Like there's a very famous TV special that aired on NBC on October 22nd, 1988 called Devil Worship: Exposing Satan's Underground, which was this hysterical, and I mean in the sense of a hysteria, special hosted by Geraldo Rivera, where he claimed that there was this underground network of, devil worshippers who were, entrapping your kids through metal music and through, they didn't talk about D&D, interestingly, but like they mostly focused on heavy metal, and like that there was this sort of underground network of Satanists, and this got a lot of attention. It was watched in about 19.8 million homes. Although what's really funny about that is it really hurt the advertising on NBC, because it's really hard to sell a program where you are talking a lot about ritual abuse, especially when it involves children. They brought in the McMartin preschool scandal parents onto it, and no one wanted to touch this thing. NBC actually had to sell ad space at half their price. So I find it kind of funny that they both got a lot of eyes on this and it became something of a boondoggle for them. I found that very, very amusing.
Satanism is more than a hodgepodge of mysticism and fantasy, more than a Halloween motif. It's a violent impulse. It preys on the emotionally vulnerable, especially teenagers, often lonely and lost.
It basically started out like with the killing of animals. Then there's always the heavy metal music, and drugs don't help.
It attracts the angry and the powerless, who often sink into secret lives.
They asked me if I had ever thought about killing somebody just to watch them die, and they asked me if I would like to join a satanic cult.
Possessed by an obsessive fascination with sex and drugs, and yes, heavy metal rock and roll.
Satan's child.
Often Satanism seems to be a personal psychodrama, a kind of license for strange, sometimes violent behavior.
A bloodbath would be a cleansing and purification of a planet that has been dirtied and degraded for too long.
Sometimes it's just half-baked mumbo-jumbo and scrawled symbols, but other times it goes deeper, deadly.
So all this is to say that Pulling is in these circles. She's getting broadcast by, law enforcement and the media and evangelical Christians, people who had a lot of vested interest in broadcasting her ideas for a variety of reasons. But that isn't to say that she went unchallenged. And there were some critics who did push back against her allegations, and unlike Pulling, actually brought receipts for them. For example, Pat played pretty fast and loose with statistics. In 1988, she explained to a reporter that she estimated that roughly 8% of people in the Richmond, Virginia area, if you recall, that's where she lives, that 8% of the people in the Richmond, Virginia area were Satanists, which, if true, according to an April the 7th, 1989 report in the Richmond News Leader, would mean that there were more practicing Satanists in the area than there were Methodists. And there are people who tried to extrapolate her data because she says 8%. And also, the way she got to that 8% is she claimed that 4% of children were Satanists and 4% of adults were Satanists, and then put those two numbers together because 4 plus 4 is 8, you see, because that's how statistics work. Another set of people who took issue with Pulling's claims were the folks at TSR, who were forced to answer for their alleged occult and murderous involvement pretty much anywhere Pulling and Tom Radecki appeared. I mean, ultimately, it probably wasn't a big deal for them because, again, they were still making money pretty well. Again, about a 4 million player base by the mid-1980s for D&D. But it was a headache for them to deal with this. So in a 1985 interview with Ed Bradley for 60 Minutes, TSR head Gary Gygax could barely conceal his contempt for Pulling when he explained the following. So I've got a quotation. Who wants to do this one?
Since it's a Gygax quote, I think it might make sense that I read it, maybe.
All right.
Yeah, this episode is painful to watch.
Oh, yeah. It's awful.
All right. There's no link, except perhaps in the minds of those people who are looking desperately for any other cause than perhaps their own failure as a parent for their child's death. Further, anything can be abused. Are we going to try to go around and say this chair, and he points to the chair that he's sitting in, could be used by a violent person to strike another person? Therefore, it should have a warning label on it saying, "Caution, this could be used to assault you with."
Yeah, he's pissed. Gygax is pissed in this interview.
Yeah, Gygax is not a happy man. I mean, I don't blame him. If you've seen it, I mean, everything's against him in it.
Yeah, the whole segment is biased against TSR. They were basically painted as this sort of scummy company capitalizing on children, basically, preying on them. Some also took a closer look into Bink Pulling's son's demise. So, Pat Pulling, her whole crusade is built on Bink's death. But people start to look into this a little bit more to kind of see if there was more to Pat's origin story than she was letting on. And you might be surprised to know folks identified some cracks in Pat's assertions that an evil role-playing game turned her son into a murderous werewolf who could only escape the overwhelming compulsion to kill in Satan's name by ending his own life. One of the biggest questions involved Bink's mental state at the time of his death, something we covered a bit in our last episode. We introduced Bink's death. Pat assured her audiences that Bink's death came out of nowhere with no warning signs. As she explained to Ed Bradley of 60 Minutes during that same segment where we quoted from Gygax, quote, "He had no psychological problems. He was healthy, even physically healthy," end quote. However, despite Pat's assertions that Bink was a perfectly normal teenager with no red flags before his D&D-induced suicide, according to other sources, there was plenty of evidence that Bink was a troubled young man grappling with demons that had nothing to do with TTRPGs. In 1983, Michael Isikoff of the Washington Post reached out to several of Bink's former classmates for a report on Pulling and her crusade that ran on August the 13th, 1983, and they painted a significantly different picture of Bink's mental state. And I'll put the quote for you to read this one, Kate.
Classmates of Pulling yesterday described him as an unusually bright youth who was enrolled in the school's talented and gifted program for students with high IQs. They said, however, that he also had trouble, quote, fitting in, and became dejected when he was unable to find a campaign manager when he ran for a school office. Shortly before his death, he wrote, quote, "Life is a joke" on the blackboard in one of his classes. One of classmates said, quote, "He had a lot of problems anyway that weren't associated with the game," said Victoria Rock Charlie, another classmate of Pulling's at the Talented and Gifted program.
And behind closed doors, where she wasn't speaking to the press, Pat offered some disturbing details about Bink leading up to his death. During a speech Pulling gave in September 1986 at the North Colorado South Wyoming Detectives Association, she claimed she observed Bink's descent into lycanthropy, but I guess didn't feel the need to say or do anything about it, which an observer recalled, quote, "He growled, screamed, walked on all fours, and clawed the ground. 19 rabbits raised by the Pullings were found torn to pieces in the last 3 weeks of his life, although stray dogs were never seen. A cat was found disemboweled with a knife," end quote.
Wait, I'm sorry. Is the implication is that this teenager gored and disemboweled and killed 19 rabbits? Do you believe that? Because that seems just as sensationalist as anything we're talking about right now.
Do I believe that?
Yeah.
This is what Pulling told people that Bink was going through. Do I believe this? No, probably not. But if that's the case, then, that's not healthy. It's not exactly what we call normal teenage boy stuff.
Well, I wonder what she was implying.
It seems like she's implying that she's witnessing what this curse is doing, which contradicts what she said in other places. So later on the Devil's Web, she does not talk about this. She claims that it came out of nowhere and that there were no warning signs and that there was no evidence that he was exhibiting any kind of issues. But here she's saying a significantly different thing. One that is extremely troubling if it is true. One that would require some level of intervention. I'm not a child psychologist, but you think we would do something about it.
So that could just be a lie, or it could be something else, yeah. It's just, when you get to this level of discourse where it's like, I don't believe you on certain parts, but I could believe you on other parts. It gets so hard to have a real conversation with a person like this, yeah.
Yeah. So troubling stuff here. Pulling also liked to share copies of what was presumably Bink's character sheet on which he had sketched a swastika. Remember that he compared himself to Hitler in a suicide note. In an interview for a segment on that 60 Minutes episode I referenced before, Bink's younger sister Melissa recalled that her brother once threatened to kill her, framed in the interview as a threat that if she told anyone he was playing D&D, although it could just as easily be interpreted as a red flag for these larger issues going on for Bink. And Again, assuming Pat's accounts are true, and as I mentioned earlier, that's a dicey proposition. The signs seem to point to a disturbed young man grappling with depression and violent impulses. And, for Pulling, these were the result of an insidious outside force enacted upon her son, which allowed her to frame his death as a heroic last act of defiance, Bink protecting his family from the evil that had suddenly possessed him. However, one could just as easily frame Bink's troubling behavior leading up to his death as warning signs of severe mental health issues, although again, I'm not a mental health expert. It sounds like there's a lot of really troubling things going on. Again, if both what the accounts from the Washington Post article I mentioned before and Pat's alleged accounts of what was going on to him are to be believed. For another take on what led to Bink Pulling's death, I go back to Joseph Laycock, who again wrote a book called Dangerous Games on satanic panic and did a whole thing on Dungeons and Dragons. It's a great book. I totally recommend checking it out if you're interested in this topic. Of course, in addition to Gathering Your Games, read them both. They're great books.
Yeah, I want to second that. That book's great. And so is Gathering Gamers. Go for it.
Yeah, I'll put a link to where you can buy it. So Laycock did a bunch of original research and tracked down a person who knew Bink and offered an alternative theory about what might have inspired Bink to take his own life.
While researching this book, I sought out a source who had been able to observe Bink closely before his suicide. The source agreed to share information on the condition that his or her name be withheld. According to this source, Bink only played D&D at school for a total of 9 hours. In this person's opinion, Bink's suicide had been an act of aggression toward his mother. Both of his parents had been having affairs before the suicide. Bink shot himself with a .38 caliber pistol that belonged to his mother, and his choice to commit suicide on the front porch appeared to be a deliberate attempt to shock and horrify his parents when they returned home. Faced with this possibility, it is little wonder that Pulling chose to believe her son's death was caused entirely by a game he played at school.
So yeah, potentially more context for this, taking into account the length of time that was between this person and recalling it to Laycock and all those things, but potentially might be more about the circumstances of Bink's death. And
like going back to last episode, our interpretation of her potential reaction in the immediate wake of her child's tragic death when she came home and found him on the lawn, right? Like you grapple for a reason. It sounds like she was entirely blindsided, and I cannot imagine what she went through coming home with her daughter with the Disney World tickets or Disneyland tickets and finding him on the lawn like that, and the police officer talking to her. Like, yeah, you grapple for any reason, And if he had said something else entirely that had nothing to do with anything we're talking about, anything related to gaming, if he had said, "Oh, it's about, A, B, or C, anything else, Then, like, if he said, it might have been because he was a vegetarian or something like that, then it'd be all about vegetarianism, not this. She was steered in this direction, and I think that that's what led her here, and what led to a lot of the branchings out of her crusade, right? Because she, in my opinion, like if she was steered in this direction, it makes sense, everything we see here, right?
well, yeah, and it's no one is downplaying or dismissing what Pat went through. Pat went through a terrible tragedy. There's no question. There's no doubt about that. The issue is, where did she direct that grief? Where did she direct?
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's like, that's what I mean. It's like she directed her grief here because she was directed there in the immediate wake of her child's death.
Yeah, I agree with you, Kate. If the police officer showed up and said, like, oh, Mickey Mouse is why this happened, she would have launched a crusade against Mickey Mouse for the rest of her days.
Right.
Like, it so happened the officer suggested that it was Satanism, and that led to Dungeons and Dragons and all of that, and that's why she chose the path she did. And it's, it's somewhat understandable. I mean,
but it's like I need to make sense of this. I can latch onto the thing in the immediate wake of it. The police officer said, "Did your son play Dungeons and Dragons?" Yes, he did. That's it then, right? Then let me go down that rabbit hole. And then that becomes a crusade. Then that just becomes part of me. And I almost forget about, you know what I mean? Like, it's like that just becomes everything about me, everything about my child's death and about what I'm doing now, right? I guess what I'm trying to say is there's nothing about Pat Pulling that seems inauthentic, right? I don't think that she is doing this in any way that she does not believe in this wholeheartedly. I think she does.
At least in the beginning, agree with that. After
Yes.
she's doing this for 5, 10 plus years, I think you can call that more into question.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair.
I don't doubt her initial sincerity. I have severe questions about the way that she wields her crusade against Dungeons and Dragons, the arguments she makes. And as we're going to see, like, people have called her on the fact that, like, not just the logical leaps, but a lot of questionable research that she does. I think that, again, I think this starts from a genuine place, but I don't know if that carries through the rest of her campaign.
And then now she's just like the anti-Dungeons and Dragons person. So if it's right, like if it's about that, then I'm against that regardless. You know what else? Is that
Well, it's that, and it's like, it's anything going ahead, and we're going to talk about this in a second with someone who critically examined her research, is like, I think she got into an ends justify the means kind of thing. It didn't matter how she conveyed her argument. It didn't matter how dubious her foundation for her claims was. That got to a point where I think it didn't matter to Pat anymore. Like, I still think she was trying to find meaning. She was. But I also feel like there are elements of this that are a grift.
But at this point, I need to be personally right that D&D is the problem.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. That's what, yeah, that makes sense. It's like, it doesn't matter how I got to this point. It's like, I am now more invested in being personally right that D&D is the problem.
And there's so many other people who come up through this. Again, going back to Mike Warnke, the guy who wrote The Satan Seller, and the folks who put out Michelle Remembers are part of that, and the countless people who claim that they were satanic experts who trained police, and the people who are evangelical Christians saying that Satan was among us and things like that. They're all coming from similar means of doing this.
They're all branching out from the same panic, the satanic panic, if you will. Yeah.
And they're fueling each other. And like, you could say some of them maybe believe it, but some of them are definitely, like, Mike Warnke is totally a grifter. He made up everything about his background. He basically sold a lie that he knew evangelicals would buy. That's what I would say for him. You can make the argument that, like, you know, not for nothing, Pat is, of course, doing speaker series and talks and, like, going around. I think of, like, Dave Grossman, who did a similar thing with violent video games in the 90s and 2000s. He made a very lucrative business doing speaking engagements, for example, for thousands of dollars at a time. But, like, I'm not suggesting that Pat is only doing this for the money. I think that she's also, there's a genuine level of, like, you know, trying to do right by her son. But there's also this element of it, too, I think, that can't be discounted.
I mean, it sounds like she loses sight of her son. The farther she gets from his death, the more she gets into this crusade, the farther she gets from actually doing right by her son.
Yeah, I think the further this goes on, the more Bink's death becomes a prop.
Yeah.
So, aside from questions about Bink's mental state, there were numerous other issues regarding Pat's assertions of the insidious effects of Dungeons and Dragons. For example, gamers pointed out that despite claiming that she at one point played for hours at a time every day for a whole month,
which I don't believe, as anybody who has tried to organize a campaign.
Despite claiming that, Pulling demonstrated a clear lack of any understanding of the mechanics or practicalities of D&D. For example, she was utterly convinced that the DM was a sole figure in a similar vein to a cult leader. One of the things she would have police officers look for is to demand alleged cult indoctrinated kids say who their DM is. And, like, who is your cult leader, basically? And, like, anybody who's played D&D will tell you that most groups will cycle DMs. Like, there's no one DM. But that didn't fit her worldview. She was coming from a cult mentality. And so, basically, she would say if they're saying multiple DMs, that they're lying. So she was convinced multiple DMs was not really a thing in D&D groups, or these covens.
But, I'm sorry, was the implication that one campaign would have multiple DMs?
No, she didn't think about things in terms of multiple campaigns, that a D&D group would have one sole DM who controlled everything. So if you're a group of people and you're with them long enough, most people will have a chance rotating DMs. It won't necessarily be one person. That didn't fit into her worldview, so she just discounted it. So people would point this out. Also, people connected to alleged victims of D&D-induced psychosis also contested her claims. For example, there was the case of Daniel and Stephen Irwin, who were a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old who died in a murder-suicide on November 2nd, 1984. According to Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons material, such as pamphlets and The Devil's Web, the two had entered a ritual suicide pact after marathon D&D sessions. However, Daniel and Steve's parents pushed back, telling a reporter in 1985 their son's deaths were brought upon by Daniel's recent conviction for Grand Theft Auto. Yet BADD continued to claim the boys as D&D victims against their family's wishes because, they thought the ends justified the means. The reality didn't matter as much as the specter that D&D cost us. People have contested, they would often list names of people who allegedly died after results of D&D obsession. I mentioned last time how Pulling claimed her son died on the night of a full moon because he thought he was turning into a werewolf, and he didn't. She also tried to claim that a bunch of deaths, including Daniel and Stephen Irwin's, happened on the night of a full moon, claiming it was part of a satanic ritual, and that wasn't true either. A lot of this was made up. But perhaps the most comprehensive takedown of Pulling came from game designer and author Michael Stackpole. Is anyone here familiar with Michael Stackpole?
Oh yes, I am very familiar with Stackpole's writing. I love the books he's written, and I'll let you talk about it, Kevin, but yes, this is in tabletop circles, his takedown of all of this is very well known and famous.
Do you know Michael Stackpole, Kate?
No.
All right. Stackpole's fun. He's a prolific writer. Even to this day, his niche is primarily in licensed tie-in fiction for various sci-fi and fantasy brands. He's written for Star Wars. He's written for BattleTech. He's written for Magic the Gathering. He wrote a Dark Souls tie-in novel called Dark Souls Mask of Vindication, which I read. It's okay. It's a very, very loose adaptation of Dark Souls, but we don't have time to talk.
I've read through a lot of his Star Wars work, and honestly, the past couple of years, I don't know why, I've had a resurgence obsession with BattleTech, and I've been reading through lots and lots of BattleTech stuff, including Michael Stackpole stuff. So if you like licensed sci-fi, gamer tie-in fiction, check him out for that, but he's also worth checking out for his opinions on the Satanic Panic.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So Stackpole penned an examination of Pulling titled Game Hysteria and the Truth, which appeared in a 1989 compilation debunking the Satanic Panic called Satanism in America. He later then expanded his ideas in a 1990 article simply called The Pulling Report. In the Pulling report, he described the head of BADD as, quote, the Exxon Valdez of ignorance. She's full of it, she's leaking it all over, and it's left to the rest of us to clean it up, end quote. Later calling the Devil's Web, quote, a monument to illogical thinking and innuendo, end quote. This is pretty well known in the D&D community. I imagine you can speak more of that than I can, Matt, about the Pulling report and about this takedown of Pat.
Yeah, I don't know what there's to add about it. I've read it a couple times, but it's been a few years. But yeah, it's an epic takedown that tabletop role players generally take to be like, yes, Michael Stackpole gets it. He's speaking everything about what's wrong with Pat Pulling and BADD and the whole Satanic Panic about this, and basically turning it in their face and giving them the truth and what it's about. So yeah, it's a great takedown from someone known for writing military sci-fi fiction, which you wouldn't necessarily expect. But yeah.
Yeah, and he knows his stuff in this too. Like, he will go through and dissect the games that Pat mentions. He does a whole thing about like, okay, this game is out of print. This game no one plays. This game is out of print. She doesn't mention any game beyond like 1982. So she's clearly not caught up on the current state of the tabletop scene. He points out lots of inconsistencies about the way she represents D&D. He takes on a lot of things: her poor grasp of D&D concepts, her weak credentials, her misrepresentation of facts, and her uncritical reporting of accounts from confessed murderers and psychopathic serial killers who, had definitely nothing to gain by saying some insidious outside force caused all their murders. Stackpole also noted that Pat had a bad habit of outright doctoring evidence to better support her claims, noting how she would include newspaper clippings of alleged occult crimes with whole sections cut out that contradicted her, including that 1983 Washington Post article I mentioned a few minutes ago, which offered other non-D&D explanations for her son's death. He cites elements where she shows, like, effectively scans or photocopies of those articles where she's just completely excised the sections that, like, he had other issues going on. It's not just that she's misled, but she's actively misleading people and is actively suppressing information that contradicts her arguments. And he concluded with the following summary of Pat's crusade. I'll read this one. Patricia Pulling, like any responsible adult, is concerned for the welfare and well-being of children in our society. A personal tragedy in her life galvanized her and started her off in a crusade to save children from the horror she saw as having taken her son. Her motivation, both at the beginning and now, is something we can only guess at, but clearly she believes she is fighting a war against diabolical forces poised to consume young Americans. Just as clearly, somewhere in her career as an investigator, she lost her perspective. She has willfully or negligently manufactured reports concerning suicides and murders related to games and Satanism. She has promoted individuals who are at the very least in need of serious psychiatric help to deal with their emotional and psychological problems. She has repeatedly represented herself as an expert witness concerning games of which she knows little or nothing. She has perpetrated a deception concerning the circumstances surrounding the senseless death of her son. Without a doubt, Mrs. Pulling started searching for a way to prevent other children from following in her son's footsteps. Her efforts on behalf of his memory were obviously well-intentioned, but as the anti-game hysteria bled over into a war against Satan, the ends began to justify the means. What became important was to sound a clarion call concerning the dangers of Satanism, and any method that worked to get that message out was perfectly acceptable, end quote. And so, pretty epic takedown of Pat. His basic argument at the end of the Pulling report is basically that, she started this out with, good intentions. Obviously, she went through a horrible tragedy. She went through the loss of her son. And she saw this as a contributing factor. She clearly did not, she didn't, no one wanted this to happen. She clearly did not want this to happen to other people. But he sees this as, over time, she began to look at it as kind of an ends justify the means. She became, by his estimation, either unaware or uninterested in the actual impact of tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons on people, and appeared to be okay with, playing a bit fast and loose with facts, if not outright manipulating or altering data to suit her ends. So, Matt, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, what was the sense in the community and like the Gen Con community and sort of the gaming community at large over BADD, over Pulling, and over this particular backlash over Dungeons and Dragons?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to talk about the reception by the gaming community about Pat Pulling or BADD specifically. Gamers kind of looked at it more holistically because they felt very under attack just in whole from, kind of religious movements that they saw it going against this. I know many of them felt personally persecuted and things like that about Dungeons and Dragons and it claims about being satanic and that bleeding over in other games. Although I will say one of the things that I find fascinating about this whole thing is that like the blame, with a couple of exceptions, really was primarily stuck on Dungeons and Dragons. So if you were playing Call of Cthulhu, for example, which I would say has way more claims to being a satanic game or something like that, you might have flew under the radar and not really have been noticed so much by BADD or this other community that were rallying against the games. So there's several different things that happen, and it depends on the level you want to look at it. So TSR obviously was at the forefront of this. I believe I talked a little bit about this earlier, but they took immediate action. They felt very under attack. There was the 60 Minutes interview that Gary Gygax was in that was very hostile towards him. So they were on the defense. And, they took all sorts of cautions in regards to making sure the game was basically as least offensive to this audience as possible. And they took out special dispensations to make sure this didn't happen. They came out with a code that their games would be made under that was very similar to the comics code to try to ensure that, these were, good-hearted nature's games that kids could play. Because again, in the early 80s, as I mentioned, after James Ellis Egbert situation came to light and this broke national news, D&D got real popular with the preteens and early teen crowd. So it was all about convincing parents not to do this and throw the game away. And there were all kinds of rumors. I don't know if any of these actually happened, for instance, but I've always heard secondhand reports of there being like religious book burnings of D&D books, where religious communities would get together and they'd buy up a whole bunch of players' handbooks or dungeon masters' guides and go out into the woods somewhere and they just hold a huge bonfire burning these books because they were satanic and they wanted to get rid of them, which always cracks me up because it's like, unless they're stealing those books, they're paying for them and then they're going and burning everything they just paid for. But hey, whatever you want to do. On a more personal level that I do have familiarity with, I know there are several parents that bought into this because I know I personally had friends when I was trying to play Dungeons and Dragons when I was myself a preteen or so, that their parents wouldn't let them play Dungeons and Dragons because they heard it was satanic or whatever. And I thought that was like the most egregious and ridiculous thing ever. And my friends, of course, didn't know any better and they wanted to play. But still, it definitely prevented some kids from actually playing the game, even though it might have made them want to. As far as Gen Con itself, so Gen Con, if you're unaware, was owned by TSR, the publisher of Dungeons & Dragons, from the early 70s up until they folded in 1996 and then went over to Wizards of the Coast in 1997. So during that time, they had a very spurious kind of stipulation that products sold at the convention had to be sort of family-friendly kind of. But again, this was very not even-handed judged out because obviously all TSR products were fine. And then you had games like Call of Cthulhu that had demons and Shoggoths and all these things in the games and on the covers would be allowed to be sold there. But then you might have a game about like an axe murderer from a horror movie that would have Ernie Gygax come down and berate you for how dare you try to sell this at Gen Con. This isn't family friendly. You can't have this here. We are banning you from selling this product at the convention. So that's that at the corporate level. On the more personal level, that people saw is that even to this day, I think I might have mentioned before, you will get people coming to Gen Con to protest it. And they are protesting it because they say Dungeons and Dragons back in the day, or more commonly these days, that role-playing games and analog games are satanic and evil, and you're going to burn in hell if you're playing them, and you need to stop right now to save your soul. So this was a much bigger nuisance in the late 80s and 90s. Like, I still remember going to Gen Con and seeing like people picketing outside. I mean, I was a teenager at the time. I didn't really understand what was going on, but I was smart enough to know at least that they were like religious fanatics that were like protesting the game because they thought they were turning everyone inside of Gen Con into Satanists. And it made no sense. And it was actually interesting because there were a couple companies that turned this around to a marketing tactic. There was a game called The End, which was released in, I want to say 97. I might have the year quite right. I don't think it was a very good game from my understanding. I've never played it. But they actually set up their own picket line outside of Gen Con about the end being near and doing things to kind of, promote their game and also mock these protesters coming in saying how evil role-playing games are, where here they are coming out with a game about the apocalypse, basically. So yeah, it's there. There's other parodies that have gone on. I mean, there's the Dark Dungeons Chick Tract. I know that's been turned into like a movie that got produced in 2014, 2013, something like that came out that was mocking this whole kind of like satanic and D&D will drive you to suicide element. And this kind of persists to this day. I mean, I remember even this most recent Gen Con 2025 that I was at, I had a friend who went and said that she was approached by a couple people outside that were trying to get info from her, and they were trying to do kind of one of those debate me style things about like debate me why D&D isn't evil on camera. She didn't do it because she knew it was just a trick to make her look bad on camera, but like they gave her a card and everything that said like D&D is evil, and they're trying to get rage bait content for their YouTube channel or whatever. And I mean, that stuff still happens today. It's not as common. I can't remember the last time I saw like a picket outside of Gen Con, but you definitely still get protesters and people showing up doing that kind of stuff these days. So it still persists. As far as Pat Pulling and BADD specifically, like I said, it kind of just got all rolled into like one general anti-D&D sentiment as far as most gamers seem to see it. There were some people, like we talked a little extensively about Michael Stackpole, who wrote his great essay taking BADD down and Pat Pulling down. But like, I think most people looked at it as like a movement as whole. I don't remember many people identifying, kind of like you see today, of a individual person being Pat Pulling as like the head of the movement and who they were like rallying against. Because frankly, Pat Pulling, she wasn't at the picket lines at Gen Con. She wasn't there, trying to debate individual gamers. She was, writing books and being on talk shows and things like that. So she might have been the face of the movement for people who believe this stuff, but for gamers who, basically had to deal with it on the sidelines. This is just my personal experience with it. And from what I've read, most of them didn't directly rally against her so much.
That's really interesting, especially because you see a different approach in the video gaming community. You begin to see a bunch of notable nemeses appear during the 1990s and 2000s. I think in particular of U.S. Senator Joseph Lieberman, who was the head of the hearings in 1993 and 1994 that really turned violent video games into a national political issue. A lot of denunciations of Joe Lieberman. We talked about Postal off my Writing with Scissors said it cites very directly on Joe Lieberman. In Postal 2, which came out in 2003, the easiest difficulty is literally called Lieber mode. There's also, of course, Jack Thompson. Jack Thompson, we've covered a lot on the show, really became a personality. And a lot of that helped because Jack Thompson loved attention. He loved to be in front of a camera, and he also loved to debate people online. He would go on to gaming message boards. He loved going into Game Politics, this one gaming blog from the early 2000s. And he would literally argue with people in the comments on any article related to him. So it's interesting to see how that contrasted in the tabletop role-playing community. And I guess the other thing I'm thinking about that is how in a lot of these moral panics you see like one particular title becomes a kind of spokesperson for that. And maybe that's some of the ways that the moral activists kind of market it too. Like Dungeons and Dragons is the biggest role-playing game of the time in the 1980s. But also having that kind of like parallel thing where it's also amplifying the attention of the game. And, any publicity is good publicity. And the thing you pointed out with, if they were actually having these sessions where they're burning copies, it also means, not only are they getting attention, it means they're also potentially getting extra sales out of that too. And outrage money pays the same as regular money does.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I always find that funny. I've always seen that when people, whether they're burning Nike shoes or shooting up cans of Bud Light or burning D&D books, it's like they're still paying for that stuff. So how much does the company really care? Plus, they're giving them free advertising. Maybe it's negative advertising, but I'm sure it's still going to get them some more sales from somebody. So.
Well, and to your point, Matt, like it sounds like part of the impact of this was that kids wanted to play D&D more because it's the game that they were not supposed to play.
Yeah, I mean, that was certainly my personal experience as like a preteen teenager. Was I didn't have a lot of friends that had grandparents or parents who didn't want them playing because they thought D&D was satanic. But like they were all like, "Oh, my friends are doing this is cool. I want to do it." And like this wasn't my personal experience, but I've definitely heard from other people who I've met in my adult life that, like, you know, some of these kids would have their friends buy them books and they would hide them under their beds and, you know, sneak them around and all this stuff. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely something there that it kind of created the taboo topic that every kid had to play because, you know, mom and dad didn't want you to do it. It must be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you could count that for any one of a number of other things that youth media is associated with, you know. In the 1980s, of course, there were also the panic over heavy metal. And if you see like Black Sabbath and like Ozzy Osbourne is on that hysterical Geraldo special on Satanism in the late 1980s, that like, well, you know, I'm going to check out Black Sabbath albums. I'm going to check out Ozzy Osbourne. I think you see that also with D&D. It certainly worked on me when it came to video games. Like I remember the first time I ever heard of Doom 2 was when I started seeing it covered on the news. And like, you know what? I want to play this game. I mean, that's part of what got me into that particular type of video game and shaped a lot of the way I approach games. I was playing before this. We were watching a horror movie and I was playing Doom 2 on my Switch. You know, it's the ways these kind of Streisand effect things happen where they're both, you know, ostensibly warning about the dangers, but they're also amplifying. And of course, kids are going to do the things that, you know, their parents say is not good for them.
Yeah. No, I think part of the reason it might have turned out a little differently for role-playing games in the 80s and 90s than video games in the 90s and early 2000s has to be with how TSR's perception was of their market, because they knew that their growing segment was, you know, children, basically, people under 18. But I think they had a mental view that they love to play these games, and they were in their 30s and 40s, you know, at this time. And so they viewed naturally other gamers as being of a similar age, or at least college level and able to control their own pocketbooks. But they seemed overly concerned about making sure mommy and daddy were convinced it was a good game, so they would buy the books for their kids without thinking that the kids might have other ways to acquire these books, you know, without going through their parents. I don't know. That's just a theory of mine. I don't have anything hard to back that up, but I definitely know that there was a conflict between, you know, the kind of age of people who were actually playing RPGs in the early 1980s in particular, and who was attending conventions, and the perceptions of who these games were targeted for. That's a big conflict where you had lots of teenagers and preteens playing D&D, but you just get the sense reading through some of TSR's stuff, they really wanted to be selling to like college age and up, but that wasn't necessarily who was playing their stuff at the time. And I think that reflects in their marketing and their response to the satanic panic.
Did you want to jump in on that, Kate?
No, just that's a really interesting observation. It's like the upshot was there was more attention drawn to the game, but it was a different audience than they were necessarily trying to attract.
So that's kind of where we get to by the late 1980s with her. So what we're going to do now is kind of start wrapping up our tale. And so, as you pointed out, Matt, there's still these concerns about Dungeons and Dragons. They still continue into the present day, but they kind of lose their luster as something that, like, you know, the general popular media is paying attention to. You're definitely seeing a dropping off of attention over it in sort of like the general news. You're not seeing like 60-minute specials, at least as frequently as you did in the 1980s, for example. And that I would argue that by the early 1990s, you know, the evil specter of tabletop role-playing games began to lose their luster among the moral crusader crowd, who moved on to the new hotness threatening America's children, those nasty electronic games. And moral activists of various shapes raised the alarms over video game violence, culminating in a series of congressional hearings between 1993 and 1994 that eventually led to the creation of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board. And for more on the complex history of how that came about, I encourage people to check out our previous episodes. We did a whole series on that. And one of those groups, I wanted to at least raise attention of one group that actually was one of these anti-D&D groups that moved over to video games. And one of those groups warning of the hazardous effects of Bubsy and Claws encounters of the third kind was the National Coalition on Television Violence. We talked a little bit about how they worked really closely with Pat Pulling and BADD in the crusade against Dungeons and Dragons. Pulling loved citing NCTV data, and she loved to cite from their founder and head, Dr. Thomas Radecki, in her book, The Devil's Web. And the National Coalition on Television Violence even sent a representative to Congress to testify at the December 9, 1993 hearing on video game violence. So they did send somebody to talk about the horrors of video games. However, crucially, they did not send Thomas Radecki. And so you might ask yourself why a guy who seldom passed on an opportunity to talk in front of a camera, to put out a press release and warn, you know, how Fantastic Max was ruining a generation of young people, why he skipped on such a consequential appearance. Well, that's because in 1992, the organization that Radecki both ran and founded pushed him out thanks to what he was doing in his spare time on top of demonizing Dungeons & Dragons and counting how many times Garfield mailed Nermal to Abu Dhabi on Garfield and Friends, namely exploiting his substance abuse patients for sex. This is where things get salacious.
Ew.
So on April the 10th, 1992, the Illinois Department of Professional Regulation revoked Radecki's medical license for, in their words, quote, engaging in immoral conduct of unprofessional nature with a patient, end quote, with reports revealing that he'd begun a sexual relationship with a woman he was treating for alcoholism. So while he's, denouncing, the moral ills of Dungeons and Dragons, doing some, I say less than up and up things in his personal time.
He was her doctor?
He was her doctor, yes.
Ooh, okay.
He specialized in substance misuse. When he became a psychologist, he specialized in substance misuse. And the board found out that he began engaging in a sexual relationship with one of his patients, who then reported him to the board. Because I'm not that kind of doctor, but you're not supposed to do that. Thus stripped of his livelihood, Radecki worked to turn his life around. He went to law school, earning his JD in 1998, and he got his medical license back on probation in 2002. Although he ended up losing it permanently on July the 23rd, 2012, because he got caught on film fucking a patient again, this time in Pennsylvania.
Oof.
This time they got him on camera doing this. I do not have the camera footage, but I do have
I don't want to see it. I did actually wonder though, like, do we know all the footage was acquired? Like, was this CCTV or something? Like,
dude, I wish I had details on this. I just know that because he was a board certified physician, that his board certification is public record.
yeah.
And you can search the medical records of both the state of Illinois and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for this information. And among the things I found was the ruling when he lost his license permanently, and they talked about him getting caught on film doing this.
Oof.
However, somehow being an unlicensed, disgraced former doctor didn't stop him from establishing a series of rehab clinics in the Keystone State that, according to Clarion County prosecutors, rapidly devolved into a drug-fueled sex cult where Radecki stockpiled millions of dollars worth of anti-addiction medications in his home, doling them out to female patients grappling with substance issues if they slept with him. In April 2016, he was convicted of multiple crimes, quote, including illegally, and this is all from a report from WTAE on this, quote, including illegally administering controlled substances by a doctor, conspiracy, and running a corrupt organization, end quote. And on June the 1st, 2016, Radecki was sentenced to 11 to 22 years in prison. A judge rejected his appeal for a shorter sentence in 2018, and he will likely die behind bars. And again, he spent most of his time in the 1980s on top of doing all this stuff, trying to say how bad television was for, the moral fabric of society.
I mean, I don't want to jump. It was like, it doesn't, that's bad. I don't know that there's much correlation that I see there in terms of like, yeah, D&D is bad, but I can kind of justify to myself this other awful thing I'm doing that's kind of unrelated. Like, it'd be one thing if you think D&D was bad and then in his spare time, like, he had, a level 20 character who he was speedrunning every weekend.
Or if he was like in court being like, D&D made me do it.
Yeah, well, ooh, there we go.
I wish he had done that, man. I know it's kind of a dark story, but yeah, it would be interesting if he said that he put a seduction curse or someone put a seduction curse on him during D&D or whatever. Yeah, he doesn't do that, but just the fact that he is such a public figure about this is the thing that is bad for people, and was also,
and evidently habitually over the years was doing this harmful stuff.
Yeah, not great. And meanwhile, the fate of Pat Pulling is significantly less exciting than the exploits of the former Dr. Radecki. She stepped away from BADD sometime in the early 1990s. I don't know exactly when, but she kind of drops off in the news media reports after about the late 1980s. I see roughly after The Devil's Web gets published, but this is one of those things where my research is coming up a little bit short, but she clearly at some point steps away. And BADD falls apart without her. It was kind of a one-person organization in that regard. So BADD as an organization is not really very meaningful by the 1990s. And she steps away from BADD. She began working as a realtor, as well as the commissioner of a local softball league in Richmond. She died on September the 18th, 1997 at the age of 49 after a 9-month battle with lung cancer.
Oof.
Yeah. Died fairly young. Regarding her one-woman crusade against the occult, her husband Lee told the Richmond Times-Dispatch reporter following her death, presumably with a straight face, he says this, quote, "She never set out to ban anything. She only wanted to educate parents," end quote. I would point back to her actual record of things as a counterpoint for that, but there you go. In 1997, the same year Pat Pulling died, Wizards of the Coast purchased TSR, which was bankrupt thanks to a bevy of poor business decisions we don't have time to talk about here. Although I'm sure, Matt, you could go into detail about some of the stuff that was going on at TSR by this point.
Oh, yes. TSR history is very rich and storied. If you want to get a teeny little taste of it, check out Gathering of Gamers, because some of it's in there.
One of my favorite parts is where they tried to pivot into a publishing company, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this stuff. I know they had to deal with DC Comics to publish D&D related stuff, and then they tried to go into their own publishing business, claiming they were putting out modules instead of comic books.
Yep, that happened. Probably their most ridiculous thing they tried to do was to make money by raising a sunken steamship out of Lake Geneva. So they tried to do that. They bought a needlepoint company called the Greenfield Needlewomen, if I remember correctly, and tried to branch into D&D branded, knitting and not knitting, but, needlepoint products. That's just some of their business follies. There's a lot of stories on that, for sure, all the way through, their creation and their inception up until they, basically went out of business in, 96, 97.
So yeah, check out Matt's book for more on that. So Wizards of the Coast buys up the property, and ever since, under their ownership, the Dungeons and Dragons brand has grown by leaps and bounds ever since, inspiring various new additions and spin-offs and tie-in media such as video games, novels, and 2 feature-length movies, one of which, in my opinion, is actually good.
Oh, just to interrupt, there's more than 2 movies.
Oh, is there?
I think there were like 4. If I remember correctly, there's 4 of the ones that came out around the year 2000. It's just that 2, if not 3 of them were direct-to-video release, and they were all horrendous. So,
I didn't even know about those.
Yeah, if you want to watch some bad movies, just look up D&D movies. There's like 4 or 5 of the things at least. And like you said, the most recent one is actually good. But the ones that came out 20 to 25 years ago, not so much.
I think of that one with Jeremy Irons and Marlon Wayans and a bunch of other people. That is not a good movie.
That D&D movie was like the first movie that I saw in the theater, first run, and was like, I was young enough. It's like, new movies can be bad like this. They can come out in the theater and still be bad. Like, nobody prevented them.
So yeah, and all that's, that's not even including all the countless analog and digital role-playing systems that owe part of their existence to D&D. So many other tabletop role-playing games, so many video games have their origins in some aspect of Dungeons and Dragons. It is very much a key moment. It's a nexus point in the history of gaming as a whole. In August 2025, Gen Con, the largest tabletop gaming convention in North America and the subject of Matt Shoemaker's book, Gathering of Gamers, attracted an estimated 72,000 people, its highest total ever. And Wizards of the Coast estimates that over 50 million people have played Dungeons & Dragons across the game's 50-plus year history. How many of them are closeted Satanists is anybody's guess. And with that, final thoughts.
Well, Matt, you've gone to way more Gen Cons than either of us have, so if you had to ballpark it, how many of them are closet Satanists, do you think?
Probably more than you would think. Not as many as were estimated, but this is more in the realm of like the Church of Satan, which, does public goods and things like that.
Right.
Not that we sacrifice babies in rituals in our closets, Satan types. That number, I would say, is pretty low. I don't know if I could say it's 0, but it's going to be down there.
Yeah, we could go into I'm not even going to get into Church of Satan, Satanic Temple distinctions. Most of those, they spun out of the 1970s and part of the counterculture movement, mostly because they knew it would get a rise out of Christians. Like, most people who say they're Satanists don't believe in Satan. Like, they would be very upfront about the fact that they don't believe in Satan, and they mostly just do it because it's edgy counterculture stuff, and also just because they know it's going to get a rise out of evangelical Christians, Christian conservatives. And I think it's with the Satanic Temple, correct me if I'm wrong, I always mix up the Church of Satan, the Satanic Temple. The one often uses Satanism as a jumping off point for free speech arguments in the courts. Again, using it as the idea, well, if it should be protected speech under freedom of religion and pushing the boundaries of what those things are. But yeah, going beyond that, I feel pretty confident in saying that Dungeons and Dragons was not contributing to, the greater influence of the devil in our world.
Yeah, I will say that not to call gamers devil worshippers. That's not the argument I'm trying to make here. But for many years, and even now that tabletop games are more in the mainstream. But for many years, gamers were definitely, video gamers and tabletop gamers, but I would argue tabletop gamers more so than video gamers, were viewed as kind of social outcasts and outsiders. There's a wonderful, and by wonderful, I mean absolutely awful, article that was published in an Indianapolis newspaper. I forget the exact year, but it was around 2003, 2004, about a reporter who hung out with a group of college kids who went to Gen Con, and it just portrays them as like the weirdest, most antisocial, most just bizarre group of people you could imagine. There's an incident in the article where the journalist claims that this group ran into. So to back up a little bit, the stadium where the Indianapolis Colts play is attached to the convention center that Gen Con's at. So it is not always uncommon for some Sundays of Gen Con to have a football game happening while Gen Con is happening on there. And you will have sports fans mixing and crossing with the Gen Con attendees. And in this article, this journalist claims that the group that he was with got so angry at all the sports fans walking by that they somehow procured a miniature like action figure or something of Jesse Jackson and just ripped it apart and beat it to a shred while they were complaining about normal people and sports fans and stuff like this. So there's definitely like a perception there that I could see if you're Pat Pulling, and I'm assuming Pat basically just would have described herself as a normal everyday American probably. I don't know that she did that, but that seems like her MO, that, you know, gamers could be easy to pick on, not difficult to understand. And sure, if you don't understand what they're about, why not Satan worshipers? I mean, they could do worse, maybe. I don't know. But that seems like a conclusion something like that could be drawn to.
Yeah, I have a running theory that I've been doing since I started doing the research into this show, just the scandal schemes in general, is that like there's a general anxiety among grown-ups for what young people do when they're not being observed. And like, you know, what is the popular media that they're doing? It's something that I don't necessarily have a framework for, that I don't have a context for, that is just something so different than what I am accustomed to. And that you see this happen time and again. You saw it happen with comic books in the 1950s as kids start reading comic books. And it's like, oh, the horror comics are going to do this and the superhero comics are going to do that. You see that with, you know, again, Dungeons and Dragons and heavy metal music in the 1980s are becoming popular among the young people. And they're not what I grew up with or whatever, you know, that might be the perception of someone seeing it like a Pat Pulling type. And you see that again with video games in the 1990s. I'm doing a bunch of research into Columbine shooting right now. And, you know, there's that panic over the internet by the late 1990s. And like, what are all those young people talking about online? I remember hearing when I was in grade school, like, oh, did you hear you could build bombs off stuff you find on the internet? And like, it morphed into, you know, things like, you know, the anxieties over social media now. It's all about like, there's always this concern that there's going to be something that happens to our children. And I'm speaking children, you know, in the general sense of like, it's going to do something I don't know what's going on and that makes me anxious. And I need to try to protect our, you know, precious children before they grow up warped by, you know, TikTok dances or whatever.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think there's a lot of truth to that too, for sure. I mean, yeah, adults not knowing and wanting to control every aspect of their child's life and just not understanding. It's, you know, it's easier to push something out and kind of vilify it rather than try to truly understand what's going in a lot of cases, I think. I think that's exactly what's happening with all of these movements you described.
You reminded me of when I was looking to get into graduate school, I got in contact with a professor at Penn State who had a book coming out called Men to Boys, The Making of Modern Adolescence. It's very much a screed against the things that adult men are doing with their spare time and lamenting that it isn't, you know, they aren't just necessarily like settling down and getting married and getting lucrative jobs. They're playing video games or whatever. They're indulging in these amusements that I don't like. It's a very curmudgeon-y book. And I couldn't help but think about that, where it's like, you know what, this is not something that I do. I don't like where these young people are doing these things, and therefore that's a thing that I need to talk about as a bad thing. You see a lot of that anxiety over masculine. There's all these sort of anxieties over people's societal roles relative to popular media. You know, these young men are playing D&D, they're playing too much Call of Duty, and they're not, you know, getting married and having children, you know, that kind of stuff. And you reminded me of with talking about these ideas of sort of normalcy and normality relative to these kinds of media. All right. Any other last thoughts? Anyone want to jump in on this? Kate, did you want to add anything?
No, I think we just about covered everything. This has been a really interesting and informative conversation.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. So I suppose with that, I'll make the pivot one more time back to you, Matt. So Gathering of Gamers, Matt's new book. Where can people find it, Matt?
Yeah, so right now you can find it at playstorypress.org, where you can download a PDF copy. You can get an ebook version, or you can buy a print copy. Last I checked, it's not yet on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, but it will be there very soon. It might be up on those sites by the time this episode airs. I am not sure. It's due to come out there anytime now.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on. This was a lot of fun, Matt. And that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occam Seekwe by Seek Knowledge via the Free Music Archive, used under a CC BY NCSA 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizzeri.
I'm Kate.
And I'm Matt.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next Scandal. Subscribe to Fat Roll Gaming on YouTube and listen to So We Were Talking About Beast Wars wherever you get your podcasts.